Gentlemen, when the harms of an individual immigrating from one country to another, free and exempt from any kind of government control, are so significant, both for the country they are leaving and for the country they are going to, we simply can't grant the individual that right. We say in that instance, the responsibility to protect notion that we heard down the line from the proposition team falls subordinate to state sovereignty, as we've stressed down the line on side opposition. I have three questions I want to ask of today's debate. Firstly, does the individual have a right to enter a country exempt from some extent of government control? Secondly, what is the economic effect on those countries being left and on those countries that people are coming to with the implementation of the proposition's model? And finally, what would be the effects of a policy of free immigration on levels of illegal immigration? To turn to this first question about the rights of the individual, because effectively in today's debate we had a conflict between the responsibility to protect and state sovereignty. Now, they wanted to talk about the responsibility to protect at the beginning as this really fundamental right, but in the same breath wanted to tell us that a government could give a very, very good reason as to not allow someone to enter that country. We want to know what that very, very good reason is. Is it you don't have skills, you are just going to use up social security benefits in our country and disadvantage the broader population and broader economic conditions? Because in that instance, we say that that would be a reason we should reject an individual's right to move into a country. They want us to talk about the importance, why people shouldn't have the right to racially profile. But what we say in the vast majority of countries, that is illegal anyway. There is forms of government accountability to ensure, no thanks, that the conditions on which we allow someone to enter that country. So we say that's not really a concern. What we would argue, ladies and gentlemen, is that the responsibility to protect extends insofar as a person can seek refuge when they face imminent prosecution. That is called seeking refugee status, but it doesn't extend insofar as that individual wants a minor economic advantage of moving from one country to another. And we gave you a few clear reasons why that was the case. Firstly, we talked about the importance of state sovereignty. We told you that a government has a democratic mandate from the people that elected it, and its fundamental obligation is to protect those individuals. But secondly, we say that is the acknowledgement that we limit the individual's right to freedom of movement is, for instance, acknowledged in a number of instances. Like in Malaysia, Australia and the United States, what we frequently have is doctors and teachers who are forced to work in like urban and rural areas, free from where they actually want to work straight after they graduate. Finally, we say that the harms extend when that individual seeks refuge in a country upon the backlash that that individual, no thanks, receives. What we say, for instance, is in France we have significant amounts of tension between the French majority and like Algerian and Moroccan immigrants. And what we say is that the backlash that comes from that actually harms broader immigration policies and leads to kind of social division. So on that instance, what we say, ladies and gentlemen, is that the responsibility to protect in this sort of vague way they wanted to assert that it existed isn't as important as the right to state sovereignty. But secondly, what would be the economic effects on countries being left and the countries that people are going to upon the implementation of the proposition's model? I'll consider both in turn. So what about the countries being left? We acknowledge those are predominantly developing countries. Their first reason why these countries would be okay is that people will go back. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we don't think there's a guarantee of that if situations are as dire in those countries as they seem to suggest. But moreover, what actually happens in the real world is the issue of remittances, where what we sometimes actually see is people giving money back to that country. And we see, for instance, the economy of the Philippines relies really heavily on that to keep it afloat. And what we say is that is actually really harmful, because to develop economically, you need to have skilled people working inside your borders. You can't have people sending money back. So we ultimately don't think there's a benefit there. Secondly, they said, and I'll take your point in a second, that we have this capacity to implement more aid programs that would give it some kind of greater legitimacy. But we said that just didn't make sense. There was no causation there. We think in the instance of, for instance, the East African famine, NGOs can enter those kind of countries anyway to implement aid. Your policy on immigration actually has nothing to do with it. Yeah.
This debate is simply about legitimizing the movement that already takes place, because Emma told us that there's no greater capacity for more movement What are the harms of our policy if all we're doing is allowing us to know how many people we have in our country?
What Emma told you is that there are many policy initiatives, I'll talk about this a bit later in more detail, but there are many policy initiatives by which you can reduce the level of illegal immigration occurring. I'll tell you now, for instance, immigration through the United States and Mexico as a result of increased border security has reduced from over 500,000 a year to less than 100,000 in the last couple of years. So what we say is you can reduce it, but I'll move more to that later. So what we say is the actual effect on developing countries when the most important, so like the most skilled migrants tend to move is very, very harmful. Ladies and gentlemen, we think it is immensely and profoundly difficult for instance, an Indonesian village to survive when its only doctor moves to Australia or to the United Kingdom. We think that's a real harm that occurs there. What about the countries where people are going to? Because we told you there were massive concerns of overpopulation and strains on economic resources. They told us that that just doesn't happen because that's not the kind of countries that people go to. We say the 250,000 Polish plumbers that have moved to Ireland in the last few years, by the way, that happens legally, not illegally. You just fail to understand where free immigration actually occurs in the EU. What we say is that because of problems that the Irish economy is facing, because of problems that the Greek and Italian economy are facing, even though they face significant levels of immigration from North Africa, what we say is these kind of countries aren't the ones that can support large influxes of people. They then told us that they can fill shortages of people. But ladies and gentlemen, the way in which you fill shortages for jobs is by having targeted immigration schemes whereby you control who comes in on the basis of what kind of skills they have. So you can, we don't think Ireland suffers from a shortage of plumbers. What we think it might suffer from is a shortage of doctors, in which case targeted schemes can get around that. But moreover, lastly they told us that these people are very dedicated individuals who work hard in their country. We ultimately think there isn't a guarantee of that, and the fact that often these people don't have significant levels of skills, like the large number of Algerian and Moroccan immigrants in France disproportionately use up resources on social security. We say that kind of harm, that kind of benefit was never able to be sufficiently substantiated on. So we ultimately say the economic harms exist significantly under their model, both to the countries that people are leaving and the countries where people are going. So what would be the effects of free immigration on illegal immigrants? Because some of their case largely relied on the fact that this is occurring illegally anyway. And what I firstly tell you is that just isn't the case. We can put policy initiatives in place that limit that. I already told you about the United States and Mexico. We also told you about the Pacific solution in Australia, under which the year before it was implemented, there were thousands of boats that came in. The year after, there was one boat, and that was an important policy initiative in Australia. But moreover, we say, acknowledging that we can limit that harm, we say when you can minimise that harm, even if it is going to occur to some extent, because we can minimise it, that isn't a reason that we should just legalise what happens anyway. Finally, we say that the kind of illegal immigration you wanted to talk about happens under your model. Because when you open borders, like the free immigration system in the EU, is when you have the problems of the Polish cocaine gangs, like you wanted to talk about. It's when you have the problems of things like human trafficking into the Netherlands. What we say is when you give this very, very good reason, and you're still going to reject people, that illegal immigration occurs anyway. Ladies and gentlemen, because the harms of implementing their model are so significant economically, and because their model fails to deal with issues of illegal immigration occurring anyway, this motion must fall.